Chapter 4. Rays of golden light leaped through the branches as Ayianna guided Brona over the rocky terrain. She had ridden hard through the night, skirting the edge of the Perthé plains and resting the horse only when necessary. The old mare would have done her father proud. Ayianna stretched in the saddle, her backside numb and her legs threatening to cramp. She kneaded her thigh and tried to see beyond the clusters of evergreens and oaks. She blinked the drowsy haze from her eyes. How much farther? She urged the horse on. Perhaps she'd make it in time to join her brother for the morning meal, but then she'd have to tell him what happened and deliver her father's message. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. She blinked them away and tried to focus on maneuvering between the trees. She gritted her teeth. They had better leave her father's body alone. One thing was certain. He would receive a proper burial as soon as she and her brother returned. She swiped at the tears with her scarf. Her face burned, her skin raw from the constant rubbing. Brona tugged at the reins. Ayianna patted her sweaty neck and murmured words of praise. Ahead, a swift river severed their path, and the horse halted. She flicked her ears and threw her head. "Come on, you can do it." Ayianna dug her heels into the mare's belly, and the horse plunged forward. Once across, she patted Brona's neck. "Good girl, that wasn't so." Ayianna trailed off. The forest was too quiet. Her words out of place, swallowed up by the silence. An odd stench drifted on the breeze, growing stronger. Smoke hung heavy in the air and clung to the trees. She buried her nose in the crook of her arm. Then she caught sight of Dagmar's gates. Broken and splintered, her heart stopped. No. She urged Brona onward and glanced about, searching for movement, for life. Mangled bodies of men and women covered the bailey. Hundreds of creatures the size of dogs, but with bodies like deformed men covered in wiry fur, lay among the dead. Bloody gashes ripped aside their dark fur and exposed the white of their bones. Her stomach churned. She tried calling for her brother, but the cries died within her knotted throat. To the right, small buildings ran along the curtain wall until it curved out of sight. The fortress loomed above them all, its windows blackened and void of life, like a mother grieving the loss of her children. Who would destroy a place of learning? She adjusted the bag strap around her shoulder, slid off the horse, and crumbled to the ground. The horse flinched, her eyes big and round. Her nostrils flared and she jerked her head up. "Easy there, Brona." Ayianna forced the words out and reached out to touch the horse's neck, but the mare bolted, tearing the reins from her grasp. Ayianna stumbled after her, but the horse was gone. Ayianna gripped the stone wall next to her. "I should leave, go for help, but where?" She closed her eyes for a moment and then turned back toward the gates. A man's vacant eyes stared at her, his neck oddly twisted, his throat torn. Another held what was left of his stomach as intestines spilled across the ground. Bodies atop bodies hid the ground. A blanket of flies buzzed about the corpses, crawling in and out of their gaping mouths and bloody wounds. Bile sealed her throat. She took a step and collapsed. Dry heaves forced her to retch until nothing remained. She wiped her mouth and pushed up from the ground. The metallic stench of blood and acrid smoke threatened to make her wrench again. She gritted her teeth and picked her way around the bodies, through the bailey and into the inner courtyard. A vacant crystal basin sat above the dead like a silent sentry. A shadow flitted across the edge of her vision. She whirled around, scanning the buildings in the courtyard. Had she seen something? Or was it just the haze of smoke wafting on the breeze? She inched toward the fortress, but her eyes darted back and forth. A clank resounded beyond the inner courtyard, and she halted. Had somebody survived? Or was the enemy still there? She dashed up the fortress's large wooden doors and shoved against the coarse wood. The school was in disarray. Broken tables and chairs laid upside down, shoved against the walls. Remnants of banners smoldered in the center of the room. From the rafters hung an ominous black flag. 2 golden triangles gleamed from the dark fabric. A gold snake curled in the center of the banner, weaving through the angled points of the triangles. The banner of Steigen. Dread crawled up Ayianna's spine. It couldn't be. Steigen remained in the abyss, held back by the perimeter. He couldn't have led this attack. She passed through the corridor into Dagmar's famed library. Ayianna stared. The beautiful wooden bookshelves had been hacked to pieces and scattered throughout the room. The library's vault sat open and naked, its guarded secrets gone. Heaps of ash littered the marble floor where the remains of books and scrolls lay charred and useless. She turned and rushed back outside. "Tehran!" Her voice caught in her throat. She darted through the dormitories in the outer buildings. Every door she opened, every window she peered in revealed the same horror. Death in some twisted form had seized the lives of Dagmar's inhabitants. She tried to take deep breaths, but the stench of death burned her lungs. Ayianna stumbled toward the last stone hut and tripped over a body, falling headlong into a furry carcass of one of the hideous creatures. She struggled to free herself from the tangle of arms, only to roll into a crumpled body of a young woman. Blood stained her dress and hands. Ayianna spun around and came face to face with her brother's staring eyes, his head severed from his arrow-studded body. How? Her brother! His head! She screamed. She shoved her brother's corpse away, his body cold and limp. She staggered to her feet and tumbled through the doorway of the hut. Shrieking, she raked at her arms and body, but could not remove the feel of his icy skin against hers, nor the vision forever seared in her mind. A mud-caked hand clamped around her mouth and smothered her cries. Ayianna fought and kicked. Breaking free, she fell forward and hit the ground. She rolled out of the way and snatched a discarded sword from the grass. She leapt to her feet, but black spots crowded her vision. She swayed, blinking her eyes. Where was he? A shadow slipped to her right, and she whirled to face her attacker. Disheveled black hair hung past his shoulders, but it didn't hide the scar over his left eyebrow or the gold earring in his right ear. Pirate! She clenched her teeth and swung the blade. He blocked her blow, knocking the sword from her hand. Ayianna jumped back and massaged her stinging palm. She refused to look away as he leveled his sword at her throat. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" he demanded. His gray eyes bore into hers, daring her to give him a reason to kill. "What's it to you?" She wrapped her arms around her waist. Nausea turned her gut, her throat burning. Maybe she'd vomit on him instead of fighting it. "Look, I do not wish to harm you." He stepped back, threw his sword to the ground, and wiped his hands on his brown pants. Ayianna studied him. Blood and dirt stained his ivory tunic. His dark complexion was out of place in the plains, like her father. An elf, no doubt. "Why should I trust you? I haven't killed you, have I?" Ayianna weighed his words. She straightened but never took her eyes off of him, just in case. "My name is Margetta," she said, picking the first name that had come to her mind. "Margetta, huh?" His eyes narrowed. "And what are you doing here, Margetta?" "Looking for someone." "Don't you think it's a little foolish to be wandering the plains alone and without a head covering? One might think you were up to no good." He ducked back into the hut and returned shortly with a few items. He placed them inside a bag. "What are you doing? Scavenging?" Ayianna asked. "Were you part of the sick evil that slaughtered these people?" He whirled around and pressed the edge of the blade against her neck. "I'll be careful about throwing around unfounded accusations." He withdrew and shoved the dagger into his boot. "Go back to where you came from." He grabbed a yew-bow, unstrung it, and slid it into a leather casing. "Were you here when it happened? What's it to you?" She gritted her teeth. He turned away while he tied his hair back, revealing his upturned ears. No surprise there. Ayianna glowered and crossed her arms. "I want to know who is responsible." "Go home." He shoved more things into a bag. "It isn't your responsibilities." "And it's yours?" He hesitated. "I was a guard. I'm supposed to be here, unlike you." "A guard, huh? Well, great job you did, guarding." Ayianna exploded, but no sooner had the words tumbled out than she wished they had died in her throat. The elf's face hardened and his brows furrowed, but he didn't reply. He finished strapping a scabbard to his waist. Then he snatched up his sword and sheathed it with an air of finality. Ayianna whirled around. Tears burned her cheeks again. What should I do? Where do I go? She stormed across the courtyard, unseeing. Home. She should return home. She must tell her mother what happened. Her stomach lurched. In a flurry of feathers and a piercing cry, a falcon swooped out of the sky. Ayianna looked up, and the warmth of familiarity washed over her. Her brother's bird spiraled haphazardly toward her, and then landed on her shoulder, his long talons pinching her skin. "Pharaoh!" Her voice cracked. "Liar!" She startled and glanced back at the guard. Recognition blazed in his eyes. "You are Terran's sister, Ayianna!" "What makes you say that?" His eyes narrowed. "You're not the only one who knows Pharaoh." You know my brother?" "No. He's dead, remember?" The guard clenched his teeth and started for her. "What are you doing here?" Ayianna fell back. Mounting pressure squeezed her head. Her mind reeled. Her brother and father dead, Dagmar destroyed, the guard, Pharaoh. Her disjointed thoughts spun in sorrow's vortex. Her limbs refused to move. Words escaped her. The elf came toward her, saying something, but her ears roared. Ayianna sank to her knees as tears burned her face again. "Kale, what is going on here?" A rich, deep voice broke through her daze. Ayianna glanced up. An elderly elf approached. Dirt and dried blood smeared his wrinkled bronze face, nearly hiding the dark runes marring his cheekbones. The sorrow in his amber eyes tore at her heart. He turned his gaze to the guard. Kale shook his head. "Headmaster, this is Terran's sister, Ayianna." The headmaster raised his thick white eyebrows, creasing even more wrinkles into his balding head. He looked back at Ayianna and held out his hand. "Why are you here?" She swallowed the knot in her throat and took his hand. "I was looking for my brother. My father sent me. A strange mission to send a young woman on alone, I would think." He tugged on his braided beard. "I'm sorry, but who are you?" she asked, hoping he wouldn't push for more details. The elderly elf bowed his head. "I am Saeed, High Guardian, and before yesterday, Headmaster of the Kelumsa Nutrazi." She stared at him. "I've never met a guardian before. Do you really do magic?" Saeed shook his head. "Not magic, no. We do have gifts the great Vutuko has bestowed on us." "Vutuko?" "This is neither the time nor the place to discuss the divine," Kale said. "We must hurry if we're to reach Badera before the festival starts." Saeed tugged on his long white beard again. "We cannot leave Dagmar like this." "What are you suggesting?" "We must burn them." Kale clenched his jaw and nodded. "What about the girl?" "Don't worry about me," Ayianna straightened. "I'm going home." "Out of the question," Saeed said. "I cannot in good conscience allow you to traipse across the plains by yourself." "I have to. My mother will need to know what happened." Saeed shook his head. "You don't understand. She might even be in danger. I must go." "In danger of what?" Saeed raised an eyebrow. She glanced back and forth between Saeed and Kale and gritted her teeth. "At least allow me an axe to help build the pyre." Kale's eyebrows shot up. He opened his mouth to speak, but Saeed spoke first. "So be it. Kale, find us some axes, and I will go get the oil." Several hours later, Ayianna's muscles burned and her hands bled. She gripped the axe harder and chopped the dead tree into smaller pieces. "We have enough." Ayianna whirled around, her pulse pounding in her head. It was only Kale. She lowered her axe and pushed the air out through her nose. He stooped to pick up the few logs and straightened. Ayianna dropped the axe and gathered up the severed branches. The last thing she wanted was to talk to him. She strode through the gates, trying to ignore the throbbing of her head, back, and arms. She threw her load onto the makeshift pyre and started back for more. Suddenly the world shifted and she stumbled forward. She reached for the wall and steadied herself. The cool stone soothed her burning hands, but her vision kept spinning. What was happening? She tried to blink the haze from her eyes. Her legs buckled and she collapsed. "Are you all right?" Kale's face hovered above her. Ayianna blinked. I'm fine." She sat up, but the world pitched again. She closed her eyes and leaned against the stone. She felt his hands on hers. "Your hands are bleeding." She jerked them away and glared at him. "I'm fine." "No, you're not. Here, drink." He held out a water skin. She eyed him, but finally took it and gulped down the water. The warm liquid rushed to her empty stomach. "Not too fast." He pulled it back. "When was the last time you ate?" She struggled to order her scattered thoughts. "Yesterday morning." "Here." Kale tugged a chunk of bread and some smoked meat from his knapsack and handed it to her. "Thank you." She devoured the bread and meat. He He leaned against the wall and inclined his head toward Saeed. "He'll light the fire soon." She glanced into the courtyard. The elderly elf poured oil over the pile of wood and bodies. She swallowed and tugged at the hem of her dress, her movements painful. Laying her hands in her lap, she stared down at the broken blisters. "He'll probably say a prayer if you would like to come." She didn't want to be any closer to the mound of death than she already was. Still, her brother was in there somewhere. Tears stung her eyes again. She nodded slowly. He stood and helped her to her feet. After Saeed prayed in a tongue unfamiliar to Ayianna, he lit the pyre. The flames lapped at the dry timber, escalating as they engulfed the oil-soaked wood. Her brother and father gone. She closed her eyes against the tears, but they still came. She fell to her knees and cried, "Oh, Saren, if you are real as my father has taught me, help me." A hand gripped her shoulder firmly and pulled her to her feet. She looked up. Saeed's face was wet, his eyes red. "You must hide. Someone comes. We know not if he is a friend or foe." "How many do you think?" Kale gripped his sword's hilt. He clenched his jaw, causing a vein in his forehead to bulge. "Maybe 5 or more." Ayianna heard the pounding hooves growing louder over the roar of the flames. She scanned the area for a hiding place. How could an old elf and the guard survive against so many? She glanced at the splintered gates. One hung from a hinge and rested against several barrels. She quickly ducked behind them and waited. Her heart hammered in her ears, competing with the thunder of the coming horsemen. "She couldn't have gone far," a deep voice growled. The horses' pounding hooves slowed as they passed through the gate. "What happened here?" "Who cares?" another man said. "Find the girl." It couldn't be. Ayianna held her breath. Who else would they be looking for her but her? "Hey, you there!" a voice shouted. "Yes, you old elf. Have you seen a young girl pass through here?" "I have seen many young girls here, and as you can tell, many have lost their lives and burn now on the pyre. If you wish to investigate the dead, you may do so." "Don't be smart with me, old elf. She would have passed through this morning sometime." "What business do you have with her?" Kale asked. "So you don't deny you saw a girl?" Ayianna had heard enough. She had to get out of there. Behind her, the hanging gate created a space near the ground, just large enough for her to squeeze through. She dropped to her knees and crawled toward it, but her dress restricted her movement. Cursing, she grasped its hem. Swords clashed and her heart plummeted. Kale and Saeed would die on the account of her. She hated it all. She clenched her teeth. At least Kale and Saeed stood a better chance than her father. Without a second glance, she crawled through the opening. Almost to the other side, something grabbed her dress. She spun around, expecting to see a grisly face looming over her. Instead, her dress had snagged on the splintered gate. She ripped it free, scrambled to her feet, and sprinted into the trees. The clanging swords faded as she rushed through the underbrush. Branches whipped her face, but their sting only drove her on. Deeper in the woods, the clash of battle ceased. Had Kale and Saeed survived, or would death claim them instead of her? Her mind dove back to the hut, reliving the horror of her brother's broken body. She pushed herself harder and harder, desperately wanting to outrun the images that burned behind her eyes. Run! The word echoed in the hollows of her mind, her consciousness slipping away. Run! How long? How far? She didn't know. She just ran. Her lungs burned, fighting for air. Her mind grew fuzzy. She ran until her ears ached and tears stung her eyes. And still she ran on. Exhaustion weighed down her legs. Her knees buckled and she tumbled. Ayianna struggled to her feet. Warm blood oozed down her face. Horses' hooves crashed through the brush behind her. She couldn't outrun them, but maybe she could hide. She darted through the trees, looking for sanctuary. She stumbled and hit a tree. Tears blurred her vision. Her limbs trembled. She couldn't go on much longer. Pain ripped through her side, and she toppled to the ground as darkness enclosed her in its icy grip.